Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The current module is entitled Marxist Theory of Law. The objectives of this module are to piece together from Marx's writings a kind of theory of law that we can understand him to have proposed. This module was written by Alexandru Cistelecan from Petru Maior University in Romania. I'm Akash Signator from the Lewis University of Rome. Now, Marx never developed a systematic theory of law as such. He has offered a great many insights that are scattered throughout his writings that allow us to understand or piece together his broad notion of law and the way that it developed over time. Some of the insights, for example, you can think of as the distinction between the base and the superstructure. So in that respect, an economic base of social relations versus law as a superstructure, or the critique that law is a false universal. It claims to universally articulate the reasons and interests of all of the members of society, but it in fact represents a particular class, the bourgeoisie. There are a number of insights such as these that we will group together and understand as Marx's theory of law. All of these insights collectively have held a great sway over later developments in the philosophy of law, such as in critical legal theory. And in this module, we're going to find out the origins of these later developments. When we discuss the scattered writings of Marx, we're going to broadly group them together into two main phases. One will be early Marx, and the other will be the later Marx. The early Marx covers the period from 1842 with his writings on the debates on the law on thefts of wood, and continues up to the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The later Marx covers the period from 1859, when he publishes his critique, a famous preface on the critique of political economy, and continues to very late writing in 1875, known as the Critique of the Gotha Program. So we're going to discuss Marx's thought as it develops from the early period to this late period, or from the 1842 debate concerning thefts of wood all the way up to his last great work, the Critique of the Gotha Program in 1875. We're going to discuss the early period of Marx in through four main works. The first is the debates on law on thefts of wood. The second will be Marx's very famous critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The third is what Marx wrote in his well-known essay on the Jewish question. And then the fourth and final one for early Marx will be the well-known Communist Manifesto. So let's begin with the debates on the law on thefts of wood. What's interesting about this work of Marx is that it is Marx's writings before Marx became a Marxist. In other words, Marx was working for a newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung, the German newspaper, and he broadly had liberal ideas. He was very much pro-poor and radically democratic, but his ideas were broadly conceptualized as liberal. In the process of studying this case, which I'll get into momentarily, his thought changes. He starts to realize that the vaguely liberal ideas that he holds are inadequate. And so we see in this first moment a transformation from a pro-poor and socially minded Marx into the Marxist Marx that we know today. So what is this case about the thefts of wood? In this period in Germany, forests or woods were privately owned. The property owners, the people who owned these forests or woods, slowly agitated to ensure that the long-held practice of common people walking through the woods and picking up broken wood for firewood or other uses, that this practice would be stopped. Now, this practice had gone on for centuries, but the ownership of these woods by noble families and so on represented, in some respects, the basic liberal paradigm of private property. So what the state did was, under the banner of protecting a universal interest, which is private property, they implemented a regime that didn't allow the poor to collect fallen wood. What Marx realizes in this moment is that something that claims to be universal, like the state's interest in protecting private property. I mean, none of us wants to be robbed. We all need private property protected. The state's universal interest is in fact applied in a particularist manner. So the claimed universal is in fact monopolized by a particular class, the bourgeoisie, in order to protect its own interests. In other words, Marx concludes that the law on the thefts of wood is merely an instance of a more fundamental privatization of the state by the bourgeoisie. And there's a very eloquent passage that where Marx describes this process. Marx states, "The wood thief has robbed the forest owner of wood, but the forest owner has made use of the wood thief to rob the state itself." So through this argument, Marx is claiming that the private property owners make use of supposedly universal principles like the protection of private property to own the state. The state turns out to be in the hands of vested private property interests. Now we move on to the next work in early Marx, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. This was written in 1843. The main thrust of Marx's critique is a criticism of Hegel for what he refers to as reifying a philosophical concept of universal right, and then violently forcing existing social relations to conform to this abstract idea. So Marx suggests that Hegel lays down from some vantage point what the nature of abstract or universal right is. And then he suggests that the particulars that we find are forced to conform to the idea rather than, as Marx thinks philosophy should be done, ideas should conform to the particulars. So Marx refers to this as a kind of mystification, where this mystical idea is the reality, and the particulars that should be grounding that idea or upon which that idea should be based are just violently reordered to look like the idea is true and correct. Later on in Marx's major work, Capital, Marx will rephrase this mysticism into the well-known concept of fetishism. The third work that we'll deal with in early Marx is his well-known essay on the Jewish question, which was published in 1844. This essay puts forward one of the most important aspects of Marx's thinking overall, and it's certainly pertinent to Marx's conception of law. It's a distinction that Marx draws between human emancipation, what it means for a person to really be free as a human, or political emancipation. So what it means to be free as per the terms of the Constitution or the body politic. Marx's argument is that we're fundamentally human beings, and in line with this species being, of being human being, there's a natural process of emancipation or freedom, which he will finally term a freedom from alienation. Now, this freedom from alienation is a fundamental human freedom in conformity with our being. On the other hand, what the political realm, the realm of law, offers us is not this fundamental emancipation from alienation. Rather, it's a formal freedom. For example, the declaration that all people are regarded as free and equal. So this political emancipation is merely formal. The interesting thing that Marx points out is that political emancipation not only can coexist, but generally does coexist alongside a lack of real human freedom. So political emancipation can not only coexist with the absence of human emancipation, but in fact, Marx is going to show that political emancipation turns out to be the main stumbling block and hindrance from real human emancipation. So this is a very devastating critique of the basic liberal premise that in the declaration of our fundamental rights, we find ourselves free. So this critique of liberalism also introduces or references this idea between law as a purely formal system and the real social economic relations that are there at the base, which Marx had criticized Hegel for ignoring. So Hegel introduces this notion of abstract universal right, and then he disregards what are the concrete social relations. Marx reframes that through this essay on the Jewish question to show that what we can have at the abstract level is formal equality, let's say. But that formal equality at the abstract level is completely belied and contradicted by the factual inequality that so many of us face on the ground. So what is the point of positing political emancipation when it posits it universally and abstractly, and the fundamental daily experience of the majority of people is profound lack of equality and a lack of freedom? So in this third work of early Marx, we see a continuing culmination of this idea of the contradictions between the claim of our freedom and the realities of our bondage. This comes out nowhere more clearly than in the fourth work that we're going to discuss within the first major section on early Marx, the Communist Manifesto of 1848. So all of these ideas from the earlier three works were incorporated into the Communist Manifesto through very grand and eloquent phrases. Karl Marx, along with Friedrich Engels, wrote that bourgeois jurisprudence, or the system of law, is nothing but the will of the ruling class turned into law that binds everybody. So law, in the classical liberal understanding, is the projection of everyone's reason, what it's rational to do. Hegel takes that very far in his philosophy of right. Marx suggests, quite to the contrary, that what we see, based on the ground realities, is that law is merely the universalization of the particular will of those who benefit from the capitalist system. In this respect, the state, which we normally think of as some neutral organization that's established for the good of all in line with the social contract and so on, in this perspective, the state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And this is a very devastating idea with a great deal of traction and common sense. Nevertheless, when we introduced this idea of superstructure versus base, which is to say the base being the actual economic relations, the superstructure being the thoughts, the laws, the political theories, and so on that are built upon that base, what we find is there's a slight tension in the early Marx in respect to the autonomy of the superstructure from the base. In other words, Marx has been arguing that law is something of a ruse because it pretends to be universal when it's actually representing particular interests, those interests of the capitalists that are played out at the level of the base of the economy and social relations. But he has the parallel argument that the superstructure is nothing but the articulations at the level of ideas of the actual social realities at the level of economy. So we have two simultaneous arguments. One is that the capitalists are using the instruments of the state to pursue their interests. That means that the superstructure is a tool of the capitalists, and in some way a conscious, autonomous sphere. And the other way of understanding this, that the superstructure is just the mere epiphenomenal output of the base. In other words, whatever comes from jurisprudence, law, and governance is the natural correspondence or natural output of the infrastructure. I'll try to put that a little more clearly. The tension that we find here is between whether Marx is saying that the capitalists are consciously employing the institutions of the state and law to maintain their system of false universalization and self-interest, or whether the system of law is an unconscious necessary output of the capitalist economic relations. This is not answered in Marx. Which one is it? Are they using the state laws to fulfill their interest, or are state laws fulfilling their interest because that's the natural consequence of the relationship between the superstructure and the base? We can see this tension very clearly in this passage from the Communist Manifesto, when Marx writes, "Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of the existence of your class." So it's a very clear problem here. In that sentence itself, it suggests both, that the bourgeoisie is consciously manipulating the state to universalize its law, and that the nature of jurisprudence and law is the natural outgrowth from the existing social capitalist relations. So now we move from the early Marx to the mature period of Marx's writing, starting with the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, which he wrote in 1859. This second phase of Marx will go through four writings: this preface to the critique of political economy, secondly the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse are the sort of notes that would ultimately get fleshed out in the third, which is Das Kapital, or Capital, Marx's great work, Capital, and the fourth is going to be the writing, the critique of the Gotha program. So just like in the early Marx, we dealt with Marx's conception of law in four works. In the mature Marx also, we're going to deal with these four works and try to understand what Marx had to say about the nature of jurisprudence as he matured. Now, the first thing that he's trying to do in this preface is to solve some of the tension that we had just noticed arising in rival claims in the Communist Manifesto. The question here is about the economic base versus the political and juridical superstructure. The fundamental argument is that whatever happens in the superstructure, so whatever it is, for example, that academic political scientists think, write, work about, whatever sociologists say, whatever laws lawmakers pass, all of these things which we believe to be autonomous kinds of research interests and attempts to find the truth, all of these things are ultimately just produced naturally and necessarily out of the class interests and social relations that exist at the infrastructure or the base. In other words, there is hardly anything else that I, as an academic and scholar, even can possibly say but ideas that represent and pursue the interests of the base articulating itself. So this lack of autonomy of the superstructure and its boundness to the base turns out to be something that Marx wants to clarify. The problem, as we know, is that Marx never clarifies this to anybody's satisfaction. In subsequent Marxist thought, especially in the 20th century, very prominent Marxists like Gramsci start to sow the seed for the possibility of an autonomous superstructure in relation to the base. Louis Althusser pushes this even farther with the notion that the superstructure exists in its own set of operations, free of the operations of the base, and he refers to these as ideological state apparatus. Later, Ernest de Laclau, another post-Marxist in contemporary political philosophy, completely severs the superstructure from the base, and a great deal of critical legal theory and the Frankfurt School of a post-Marxist political theoretical school was concerned or preoccupied with the nature of the superstructure as understood autonomously from the economic social relations that are there at the base. So despite what Marx attempted to do in the critique of political economy, he didn't satisfy very many people about this relationship of the superstructure and the base, whether that relationship was necessarily totally not autonomous, or whether there were degrees of autonomy in that relation. And all subsequent Marxist thought played around with the level of autonomy of the superstructure. We can end this debate with one very simple insight from the American Marxist Frederick Jameson, who cautioned us that when Marx refers to the lack of autonomy of the superstructure and its bindingness to the base, that Marx does not mean this as the solution to the problem. He means to pose this as the problem itself. So if we take Jameson's argument seriously, then we realize that when Marx writes in the preface, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness," that in so asserting, Marx is pointing out not the results of the critique of political economy, but the very problem that is posed by a capitalist political economy. Now we move on to the second work of concern in the mature Marx, and in an attempt to understand his jurisprudence. This is the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse was a work where Marx first started to tackle the liberal myths that are grounding our conception of right and law. He refers to these myths as various kinds of Robinsonades. So by Robinsonade, he's making a joke about the novel of Robinson Crusoe and the idea that every individual in the contemporary liberal state is just another Robinson Crusoe. In other words, we're atomized individuals who then negotiate on level playing fields, and that the system of right is the system, are the rules according to which we negotiate our atomic individualities. The critique of these Robinsonades lies in the argument that Marx puts forward that this natural pre-social man is just a figment of our imagination. You can think of it in terms of Hegel's philosophy of right, the portions where Hegel critiques the idea of social contract. The basis of a contract is for two autonomous adult people to engage in free and equal exchange. But where do you get the autonomous adult? You get the autonomous adult after a long process of journeying to that autonomy and journeying to that adulthood. A 1-year-old cannot sign a contract. Neither can a 10-year-old nor even a 15-year-old. You have to wait till this moment of autonomy, which is granted generally around 18 and in some cases 21. Now, if that's the case according to the reality of the situation, how do we project that the formation of the state was a result of an agreement between autonomous adults. You can't have autonomous adults without the state. So Hegel points out that there is a self-contradiction projected in social contract thinking. Marx takes that self-contradiction and says that it's not an unconscious or accidental contradiction, rather it's a purposeful one constructed by liberal bourgeoisie thinkers in order to naturalize the unnatural specifics of the nation state, which is designed to favor a particular class. So if we were to project, if we were to rely on early Marx and we see that what the law is and what abstract right is in fact not universal but the particular interests of the class, then we can see that the political philosophy that argues for the justification or legitimacy of that law through ideas like social contract is nothing but a projection, an attempt to naturalize, make natural what is actually artificial and favoring a particular class. The naturalization process of ideas that in fact favor a particular class is effected through things like Robinson Crusoe, or the argument that we are all naturally free and individual and engage in a cooperative society in order to pursue the greater good. Well, that's liberal philosophy, but liberal philosophy is superstructure, it's ideology generated out of the base, which is capitalist social relations. And the truth of the matter is we are not engaged in contemporary society for the good of all. We are all victims of exploitation of a capitalist system which favors the property owning class capitalists. Now we move on from the Grundrisse to Capital, the third book that we're going to deal with in relation to the four books that represent mature Marxist thoughts on law. What this amazing work, Capital, attempts to do in terms of legal theory is that it presents a set of critiques of capitalism that allow us to understand the nature or the false nature of law in contemporary liberal states. Marx begins by understanding what he refers to as the dialectics of the Lockean proviso in capitalism. Now, what happens according to this dialectics is that injustice is the necessary consequence of fairness. In other words, meritocracy, labor relations, these are all regulated by law. The output is, strangely, according to the dialectic, Marx argues, is injustice. Now, this flies in the face of everything that we've ever learned. What we learn is that injustice is the failure of law to work. We learn that injustice is a result of greed, and greed is not institutionalized into the legal and labor framework. Rather, the legal and labor framework institutionalize aspects of fair cooperation based on the fundamentally Lockean liberal idea, which Marx refers to as the proviso. What is this proviso? That every person is entitled to the fruits of his labor. So this is a basic liberal articulation, and at first glance, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it. Indeed, what Marx postulates as one of the main principles of a communist society is nothing but a little bit of a twist on the Lockean proviso. So how do we get from this Lockean proviso that everybody is entitled to the fruits of their labor to a condition of rampant injustice everywhere? Well, what we're normally taught is that the conditions on the ground are because the law is not properly implemented. Marx's argument is that the conditions on the ground are precisely because the law is properly implemented. This is what he calls the dialectics of the proviso in capitalism. How does this system work? We can understand Marx's mature critique in Capital based on the elements we've already addressed in his earlier writings. As we know, law is projected as a universal. that universal consists of moments of abstract right. We are formally equal, we are formally free, we are formally entitled to freedoms of speech, religion, and so on and so forth. The material reality on the ground is that we don't enjoy, in fact, any of these formal freedoms. We are told that it's because the laws are not properly implemented that we don't, on the ground, enjoy these formal freedoms. Marx's position, however, is we've already realized that law is in the interest of a particular class, and that class is the one that enjoys all the prerogatives of law and for whom the police are established to protect. In basic contradiction to the everyday idea that we have that the police are there to protect everybody, Marx points out that the function of the police is to implement the law, but the law is there as a prerogative of the capitalists. So it turns out that the police are nothing but the private force of implementation of the prerogatives of the bourgeois class. So in this respect, when we're told that the conditions on the ground are only bad because the law is not working, Marx says quite the contrary. The conditions on the ground are bad precisely because the law not only is in force, it is also enforced. So Parliament has passed laws that favor a certain class, the bourgeoisie, who have the capital, who own the property, and who enjoy rent of land and exploit our labor. The police enforce these laws. So when we try to protest against the exploitation of our labor, when we try to protest against private property preventing us from enjoying the fruits that should be publicly enjoyed, when we try to protest these things, the police come and they don't enforce universal order and abstract right. They enforce the interests of capital, the interests of the bourgeoisie, claiming that what they're enforcing are our own natural interests, that is, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on. Because in any theory of these freedoms, we can only enjoy these freedoms to the extent that we don't trample on other people's freedoms. So the police are merely pushing us back, according to the dominant liberal theory. The police are only pushing us back into the rational enjoyment of our freedoms, according to the liberal theory. But what Marx shows in Capital is what the police are doing is pushing us farther and farther away from real freedom, and they're doing it in the interests of the capitalists. So this is what Marx refers to as the dialectics of the Lockean proviso. We start with something that seems benevolent. Everyone is entitled to the fruits of his labor. But how does this get realized? It gets realized through concrete social relations. It gets realized through the capitalist entering into relations with labor and appropriating the surplus value produced by the common laborer's labor. So while the laborer is entitled, according to Locke, to the fruits of his labor, he sells the fruits of his labor in exchange for his labor. And in that process, these social relations create imbalances that are not prevented by law, but that are implemented by law. So the very imbalances built into the structure of humans selling their labor to capitalists and having the surplus value of their labor being creamed off by the bourgeoisie is what produces the poverty and the lack of our ability to enjoy real freedom. And yet, instead of those things being prevented by law, that is precisely the system of law working the way the system of law is supposed to work and enforced by the police. So now we move on to the fourth and final work in the attempt to understand Marx's idea of jurisprudence. And this is to be found in the critique of the Gotha program. What the critique of the Gotha program introduces is the two-stage theory of the transition to communism. Now, this is a very historically important event, even though this is the only place where Marx ever mentions it. This two-stage theory of the transition to communism suggests that all of the problems that we have identified with liberal bourgeois law cannot just be eliminated like that, and then you have communism. Since these problems are rampant, since they constitute the very core of the way that we all think, believe is natural, and so on, in order to get to the communist state, which overturns all of the problems thrown out by this system, where we can recuperate our species being and no longer be alienated, in order to have that experience, we're going to need a transitionary stage. That transitionary stage Marx refers to as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, what does this mean, dictatorship of the proletariat? Well, we've already learned that in the system that exists, we're suffering a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in disguise of universal right and jurisprudence. What Marx says is, once we become aware of this, then instead of scrapping the system altogether and going to communism, which is just both physically, psychologically impossible, there can be a transitional stage where the proletariat themselves monopolize the state institutions to benefit themselves. So we already know that the state functions in universal language in the particular interest of a particular class. So why don't we just change that class? We change it from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. This is the intermediate step. The proletariat exploit the false universality of law to favor their own interests. Government is no longer a committee just to regulate the business of the bourgeoisie. It becomes a committee, a Comintern, to regulate the interests of the proletariat. So this stage version of the transition to communism is introduced in the critique of the Gotha program. And what it basically tells us about Marx's philosophy of law is that you cannot overturn the consequences in terms of consciousness and human being that law inscribes into the material reality of human bodies immediately. It has to be, we have to be in some way purified of these beliefs that are deeply ingrained in us mentally and physically over a period of time. So the transition idea suggested in the critique of Gotha program has serious legal ramifications. It suggests that we are constituted by the legal system, and it may be impossible for a single generation to move from this completely monopolized mentality and control of bourgeois law into one where we are working in accordance with our abilities and receiving the fruits of our labor in accordance with our needs, which is what is the system of relations under communism. So we'll conclude now with some of the things that we have learned from the early Marx and the late Marx. Marx's idea of law is not one systematic thing. He never wrote simply some jurisprudence or philosophy of law. If we look at Marx's writings across the broad span from his very early ones, where he's in the process of becoming a Marxist instead of a liberal, to his very late ones, like the fruition of all of his thought in Capital and later editions in the critique of the Gotha program, what we see is that there's a fundamental assumption that law as institutionalized is always false. It's always tending towards the alienation of people from their greater interests. And that political emancipation is a carrot dangled in front of an essentially enslaved political community to make them distracted from real human freedom. Real human freedom will only be possible once the entire system of law is dismantled. Of course, the dismantling of the system of law, given what human nature is, can only happen slowly over time. So the big problems that we face in post-Marxist thinking is, can this ever in fact be accomplished? Thank you.